Okay.
Okay, so I'm here with Graham Oppy, and today we're going to talk about atheism, arguments for the existence of God, problem of evil. We're going to kind of touch all around. So, Graham, if you want to take a moment to introduce yourself, any current projects you're working on?
Okay, so my name's Graham Oppy. I'm a philosopher at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I've spent most of the last 30 years working in philosophy of religion, but right now the project that I'm working on, so I have a big project that's running for the next few years, is about the nature of argument and argumentation. It's obviously related to my interests in philosophy of religion, but it's actually a project that sits outside.
Wow, great. It's very interesting. Okay, so we will get right into it. Question one, what is atheism? So there's a lot of disagreement around this. You kind of get it's a lack of belief or this or that. What would you say atheism is?
So I would first of all make the point that people do use words like atheism and atheist differently, and that's fine. Uh, what I'm going to say is what I mean by the term. And if you want to understand what I'm saying, you have to bear in mind that this is how I'm using the terms. The way I use the terms is pretty much the way that professional philosophers all use the terms, right? So, um, what I say is atheism is the claim that there are no gods. Theism is the claim that there's at least one God. Many theists are monotheists. They think there's exactly one God, God with a capital G. Okay, there's a couple of other categories here. There are agnostics who suspend judgment between the two claims, so they're just undecided. There are innocents, people who've never thought about the question whether there are gods or not,
Mhm,
right? And there are various categories of people like neonates or people with advanced dementia and
mhm.
so on, who definitely fall into that category. But there could be people, and I know people at my cricket club who really just have never encountered the idea that there's a God.
Mhm.
So, yeah. Um, so, one thing to say at the beginning is that atheism has no necessary connection to lots of things that in some people's minds it's connected to. For example, nihilism or skepticism or materialism or even irreligion.
Mhm. So what would you say about lack theism? Because this is a definition I encounter a lot, especially among layman atheists, that I just lack a belief in God. But that seems to reduce to a psychological state. It really doesn't express anything about the content of atheism itself. I mean, babies lack
Um,
beliefs, cats, dogs, you know,
Rocks.
rocks, right?
Right. So you can qualify it a bit more though. You can say amongst the things that are capable
Yeah.
of belief. So you can kind
Hmm.
of avoid the problem about rocks, and perhaps you can avoid the problem about chimps on the same grounds that they're
Hmm.
not anything that's sort of capable that would be broadly capable of understanding the belief, right? So that's not really an issue. What I think is um, a more important problem here is that you don't get any mileage out of the way that you characterize your claim. So the thought behind lack theism is that, you know, I've now sort of got the high ground because I lack the belief and you've got to convince me that I should have it,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But in fact, you've if we probe, either it's going to be the case that you're undecided and then you have to defend your indecision, or you've actually decided and you think there are no gods, and then you would have to defend that position. So
Exactly.
so saying that you just don't have the belief doesn't give you any dialectical advantage. It just leaves it unclear,
Hmm.
right, in terms of the further discussion that has to be had where you stand.
Yeah, and atheism is not like agnosticism, what you mentioned earlier about a suspension of judgment or just being neutral. I mean, it's not like you're approaching the God proposition with sheer epistemological ignorance. You've really explored both sides, and you've picked a position. You've affirmed a position.
Right.
That
So,
being atheism, theism, or agnosticism.
right, that's right. And I mean, if we want, we can discriminate the positions more finely if you think that it makes sense to assign numbers to your strength of belief, then you're going to be somewhere between 0 and 100, right? And you could be anywhere on that spectrum. Now, maybe we can't. Maybe it's a bit of a exaggeration to think that we can be that specific, but there are nuances in the positions, even amongst the people who are atheists. Some of them are going to be certain. They just absolutely 100%. There are no gods, and some of them will be more tentative. It's like,
Yeah.
95% or 87% or even 60% that there's no God, and any of those will be enough to make you count as an atheist.
Right. Now, what do you think about placing percentages on belief? Like that's I feel like something I would hear. I think Richard Dawkins, his scale, 1 to 7 or whatever. Do you really think
Yeah.
that you can truly have full epistemological certainty that God does not exist or does exist?
So, and that's an interesting question. I mean, of course you can. The real interesting question is whether you could be reasonable in doing that. And I guess I don't see why not. And maybe you shouldn't be 100% unless you think that there's a proof that we can sort of know it a priori. But you could be so close to one that it makes no practical difference. And that's often how I characterize my own position. It's sort of 1 minus epsilon, where epsilon is this vanishingly small thing, right? I mean, it's not like thoughts about God play any practical role in my own deliberations about what I should do, what I should value, and so on. So effectively, um, I'm just a flat out atheist. But
Right.
that's just the point about the way that my strength of belief is. It doesn't mean that I think that everybody else should be like that.
Right. Right. Okay. So you would say it's you're pretty certain God doesn't exist, your own particular belief?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
my position.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was great. All right, let's go on to question 2. What is the best argument for the existence of God if you were to choose one, or maybe a cumulative case,
Yeah, well, that
perhaps?
is exactly the latter is exactly what I'm going to choose, right? So the best case that you can make for God is going to be one that weighs up all of the relevant considerations and comes down on the side of saying that God exists. So the best argument of this kind that I know is still the one that Richard Swinburne put forward in his about 1979 book, The Existence of God. And yes, he's revised. There's a revised edition since and so on, but we might as well focus on the kind of original
The original.
version.
Yeah.
So Swinburne's case is formulated in terms of probabilities. It's a Bayesian case. In his view, the prior probability that God exists is really high. And as you weigh in the evidence, all of the evidence is really likely given that God exists. And so he ends up concluding somewhere, he says 97%
Wow.
likely that God exists. Now, that's the right form, I think, for the best argument for theism.
Okay, so outside of a cumulative case, is there any one individual argument, maybe like contingency or fine tuning, that you would lean toward?
No,
Just the
I mean,
cumulative case. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
but I think that that's the right way to go.
Right.
I know there isn't really. So if we divide the arguments, there are going to be arguments that are meant to be deductive, so they're meant to be proofs, right? And I'm very sure that there are no such arguments on either side in this debate that work.
Mm-hmm.
The other ones are meant to be inductive or abductive, and those ones on their own can't tell you anything interesting because you have to have the whole case in
Yeah,
order to
more
know.
explanatory power.
But you just have to have the whole case, because it
Mm-hmm.
might be that there's some consideration that on its own lends some weight to one side, but it gets swamped by everything else when you go to the cumulative case. So you just should go to the cumulative case. You shouldn't worry about the other arguments. So the thought behind the deductive arguments is that there's a contradiction in the opposing position. Right. Now, if you could show that there was a contradiction in just the very idea of there being a God, then that would be a win for
Yeah.
atheism. But I'm convinced you can't do that. Equally, there's no contradiction in saying there are no gods, and so you're not going to be able to get a win for theism either out of those arguments. So I actually think that we can put the deductive arguments to one side, all of them. They just don't work. And then there's no independent interest that attaches to the remaining arguments. You've got to look to the cumulative case.
Right. Okay. So question 3, what is the best argument in favor of atheism?
Okay, so you can predict exactly what I'm going to say now, right? So the best argument's going to be one that weighs all of the relevant considerations, comes down in favour of the view that there aren't any gods. So that's a kind of case that I tried to make in my book, The Best Argument Against God, and more recently in my debate book with Kenny Pierce, Is There a God? I try to make arguments of that kind. My argument isn't Bayesian, so I have these worries that might be a bit misplaced, but anyway, I don't think that for a dispute like this one that you can in any meaningful way attach numbers to the kind of probabilities. So I think that the way that we should think about it is we just kind of write out the theories as best we can, and then we make two judgments, one about which is simpler, and one about what gets left unexplained, what gets left unexplained on the two views, and you weigh those things together in order to work out what's the better theory. So the better theory makes the best trade-off for being as simple as it can be and leaving as little unexplained as it can do. And I think that atheism does better than theism at that job, and then there are lots of people who disagree, and that's fine. There's a lot of judgments that go into making the cumulative case decision, so there's plenty of room to disagree.
What do you think about the problem of evil by itself in particular?
So I think that it's kind of standard to distinguish between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. So logical arguments from evil try to show that there's a contradiction in the theistic worldview. So now it's not just a contradiction in the claim that God exists, but it's a contradiction between three things: a set of claims about the divine attributes, some claim or other about evil, which might be just that there is evil, or it might be that there's a terrific amount of horrendous evil, or it might be that there's moral evil, right? There's lots of possibilities there. And then the third thing is a bunch of claims that link together the divine attributes and claims about evil. So, and the idea is that the set of sentences forms an inconsistent set. So Mackey, way back in the 50s, produced a logical argument from evil. I hope I'm going to remember it to get it right. He said, if there's a God, God's omnipotent. If there's a God, God's perfectly good. A perfectly good thing eliminates evil as far as it can. There are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do, and evil exists. And you can see that that set of claims is logically inconsistent. The issue is that there are no theists who accept both that there are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do, and that a perfectly good being eliminates evil as far as it can. And so the response to that argument of Mackey's is very well known. And I think that the same thing happens for every other case where you actually come up with a set of propositions that really do form an inconsistent set. You just have to ask around amongst your theistic friends, and they'll all be able to tell you, I reject this claim or that claim or that claim, right? And so the arguments don't work. So that's on the logical side. The evidential side, and that just goes back to the thing I said before, it might be that sort of ignoring everything else, there's some weight that attaches to certain facts about evil, but you have to think about the cumulative case here, and all of that, whatever weight there is there, could easily be swamped. So I'm just not interested in pursuing that discussion, because it's just not going to have any significant consequence.
Yeah, I think some natural evils. I mean, think about mental illness, for example. I mean, surely a world without mental illness would appear to be better, without persons being psychologically tortured, or just, hurricanes, tornadoes. It seems intuitive from our finite perspective, at least, that if we knew that a hurricane was going to wipe out a city tomorrow and we had the ability to stop it, that we would. But we're left wrestling with why God does not stop it.
So there's different things that you might try saying here. One thing that you might try saying, and it's a consideration that's going to have something going for it, is that we have very little experience in the art of world making, right? Designing universes. And we don't know what kinds of constraints God's operating under, even though God's omnipotent, right? There's a bunch of constraints. And so maybe God has reasons for letting it be the case that there are hurricanes and viruses and so on that we're just not privy to. He hasn't told us why, right? And that seems like it's a bit of a cost in your view, maybe, but it doesn't seem like it's an insuperable cost, right? It just goes into the weighing of things. Right, there are other people who try to say that we do know why God permits hurricanes and mental illness and so on. So they give a theodicy of some kind. The theodicies mostly strike me as not entirely satisfactory, but there are lots of theodicies, and there's a lot of argument to be had about that. So I think that it's an open question for anything that you might point to, whether a theist can have, can provide a satisfactory theodicy, something that, were it true, would explain why God permits these things. So I don't think that that there's anything here that's a kind of knockdown defeater of theism. And there is another thing too, which is that even if you could kind of knock down the idea that there's an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good creator of everything else that requires creation, that doesn't rule out all the gods. It only rules out one kind of God. There could be an indifferent God or an evil God, and an
Aristotelian concept.
An absentee God, and all sorts of possibilities, right? And as an atheist, you reject all of those too, right? When you said there are no gods, you weren't just saying there isn't the Abrahamic God,
a loving God.
So you can't think that your case is made by considerations about evil. It just obviously isn't.
Yeah. I also think, going back to the logical problem of evil, J.L. Schellenberg has brought up this prior purity claim, this idea that God is perfect, devoid of any flaws at all. And he basically argues that it seems inconsistent that evil could therefore enter the world. What do you think about that?
So that's an argument of that kind. The sort of, if the starting point is perfect, how does imperfection arise? I find that quite puzzling too. And I've said so in publications going back 20 years, right? I've never tried to develop it into an argument because of my other views about the efficacy of arguments here. But I assume that theists can find things to say in response to that. But I do think that it's odd, right? Because
Hmm.
if things were perfect, why would you take steps to make things worse?
Hmm.
Right. If you were yourself perfect and everything was perfect because there wasn't anything else,
Yeah.
right? It seems like a retrograde step to make things worse. So I
Hmm.
kind of get the intuition that Schellenberg's working
Yeah.
with. Um,
And
yeah.
and you could posit a free will defense, like Alvin Plantinga has done, that persons have free will, and in any possible world, they're going to at least make one mistake, right? But then you're left with these natural evils too, which some philosophers have said natural evil is not actually evil. Only moral evils are, because there's an agent behind it. But both circumstances,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
well, see, that's not right. If there's natural evil that's caused by God, then there is an agent behind it, right? There's one
Mhm.
of the things about having
Yeah,
God
that's
is that
interesting.
it makes the natural evils a lot worse, right?
Hmm.
Because now they're being produced by an agent. So that bit's not right.
I would agree with that.
The
Yeah.
the way that you presented um, Plantinga's argument's not quite accurate. So, and if we think that um, there is genuine libertarian freedom, right? So freedom, so that you really could, in any given circumstances, choose the good or the bad. We'll suppose it's a binary choice. Then there has to be a possible world where everyone always freely chooses the good, right? Because any combination of things that can happen is possible. And one of them just is that everyone at every step makes a good choice. So Plantinga's objection isn't that. What Plantinga thinks is that God knows ahead of time what any free creatures that he would make would actually choose to do. And if he's unlucky, he'll be in this situation where he just can't make the world where everyone always freely chooses the good. It's a
Hmm.
possible world, but one
Right.
that's not open to God to make. Right now, that relies on an assumption which I think I just want to reject, namely that God could know ahead of time what people were freely going to do. I
Hmm.
just don't believe that counterfactuals like that
Hmm.
have truth values, right? So prior to creation, there just aren't truths of that kind. So I would object to the details of Plantinga's argument. But there are other people, plenty of other people who think that Planting is right
Hmm.
about this. Plenty of theists think he's right. And so there's a kind of, I mean, it's just one of many things where there's an active disagreement.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always going to be disagreement. um, okay, so question 4. What is the ultimate foundation of all reality? Is it more likely a mind or no mind? And I would assume you would say no mind, right?
I will certainly say no
Yeah.
mind. So um,
Right.
I think it's debatable whether there is an ultimate foundation to reality in any sense that people who talk about ultimate foundations would recognize. But put that to one side.
Mhm.
According to me, minds appeared in the universe quite late in its history, and the only things that have minds so far are organisms, biological organisms that evolved. Right? You don't get the conditions that you need for the evolution of such organisms until you're into your kind of third generation of stars, because there are certain elements that you need that aren't produced until the second lot of stars going supernova. Right, so mines are late and local, so of course they're not there in the foundations, whatever the foundations might be. Um, I do think that, I mean, to give the view a bit more of a run for its money, that things like views like dualism, idealism, panpsychism, pantheism, and so on, when you compare them to naturalism, my favorite worldview, they turn out to do less well at the trade off between simplicity and explaining as much as possible. And so I'm quite happy to argue against those views in just the same way that I would argue against theism. Right.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I'm thinking about the range of views where mind is right down there as a more
Mhm.
fundamental ingredient of the universe.
Now, what do you think of the notion that minds are emerging from a non-mind foundation? Uh,
So again, I'm kind of resistant to the idea that reality comes in levels,
okay.
so that uh, so that because there is this view which many naturalists have, that you have a kind of reduction to the to the lowest level, the smallest level, sort of microphysical reduction, and you can explain everything in terms of what's there and what properties are exhibited at the lowest level. I don't think that you have a reduction of properties like that across the levels. So you can't define, say, for example, cat in terms of quarks and electrons. In
Mhm.
principle, you can't do it. Now, if that's what you mean by if you accept what I just said and you say, but that counts as emergentism, then I'm an emergentist about the mind. But
Mhm.
that's a very, very weak constraint, right? I don't think of it as emergentism, but that's because um, the way that I'm thinking about emergentism is the way that philosophers in Britain who call themselves emergentists thought about themselves in
Mhm.
the 1920s and 1930s. So people like C.D. Broad, they thought that you couldn't explain, for example, how it is that water has the properties that it does, given the properties of hydrogen and oxygen. Right. So that was their idea of emergence, was that it was just a kind of mystery what connected the properties of hydrogen
Yeah.
and oxygen to the properties of water. But that's not a cross level thing, right? Hydrogen, oxygen, and water are all on the same level, the same energy level, the same scale, right? And they're wrong. There is a way. You just have to understand um, a bit of quantum mechanics, electron shell theory, and then you can get this explanation of the properties of what you get when you put together hydrogen and oxygen in the form roughly, let's say, H2O.
Mhm.
Um, you can. So there are explanations of that kind, and I'm definitely not an emergentist in that sense. But I do think that you can't put together complete accounts of what's happening on a certain scale in terms of stuff that's happening at much lower scales. You just can't. I just don't think that that's possible.
Mhm. So, what do you think about like qualia? Uh, this notion of intentionality, like rocks have no idea what it's like to be something or material, but persons do. What do you think
So,
about that? This.
so my own preferred view of a wide range of mental um, states is a kind of restricted type identity theory of the sort that Jack Smart defended back in the mid 60s. Um, I don't think that there's any problem from that point of view in explaining what's going on when we talk about what it's like. In fact, the view was formulated in terms of the expression what it's like. So Jack said that um, that that when you see red, there's something going on in you that's like what's going on in you when you look at a ripe tomato or something like that. And his thought was that, as far as this goes, that your knowledge of what it's like, say what it's like to taste Vegemite, depends upon your being in a certain kind of state that gets generated when if you're a kind of normally functioning person and you ingest some Vegemite, right? So that the states, which he thought of as neural states, play a central role in the explanation of the phenomenon of the what it's like. So you can so when people are talking about qualia or they're talking about what it's like, it seems to me that there's just no problem there for the restricted type identity theory. So there's this idea that there's this central role that neural processes and neural states are playing in the explanation of the phenomenon.
So before we go on to the next question, I just wanted to say one more thing. I've heard this example a lot. Say you're walking upon the shore and you see written in the sand, Graham Oppy is cool, which you are cool. But you would never conclude that the waves wrote that, right? Because they're devoid of a mind. They're devoid of the ability to construct meaningful sentences.
So that's true. This is very
Yeah.
similar to, so Richard Taylor used a very similar example. If you're kind of traveling on the train between England and Wales and you come to this bit where there are these rocks arranged saying, I think it's welcome to Wales, but maybe it was something else. Of course, you're going to recognize that there were people who arranged the rocks in that formation. It's not that they chose to put the railway line past that startling rock formation that had always been there that said, welcome to Wales. So, sure, that's right. So, yes, when I'm walking along the sand, I will just infer that somebody, for reasons unknown to me, wrote this stuff in the sand. Sure. Nothing at all follows from this that's consequential to the debate between naturalists and theists.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of trying to get at. See your view on that. Yeah. So you would say nothing follows from that.
Yeah, no, just nothing follows. Taylor's original formulation of the argument, I think, and I've written about this, I can't remember where, various places. The argument's just a non sequitur. It just doesn't get to the conclusion that he wanted to get to.
Okay, so the next question, if there are contingent things, then must there be something necessary?
So,
like, do you accept the notion that there are contingent things, or maybe that the universe is contingent?
Right. So I have an open mind about all of this, right? So one view that you could have, a kind of Leibnizian view, is that everything is necessary. I think that that has kind of dismal consequences. So I don't like it, but I still have an open mind about it. What I mean by the dismal consequences is that if everything's necessary, then nothing depends on anything else, right? And so it's kind of things like agency just kind of disappear in a way that seems rather sad. So I don't like that view. A different view would be that everything's contingent. And you can have a view like that too. It will then turn out that if you're thinking about first things or boundary conditions or whatever, they all just turn out to be brute, right? They have no explanation because everything, right? So I suspect that that's not the best view. The kind of view that I like is one that starts with something that's necessary, and then the evolution of state from that initial necessary thing is indeterministic. So you get lots of contingency, and there's nothing incoherent in that picture, right? So that way you end up with there's a necessary thing and there's lots of contingency. I think that that's probably what you need if you want to have both. If you want to have some causal stuff that's necessary, but you also want there to be contingent things, then I think you're going to have some indeterminism in the production of the contingent from the necessary. Right? There's a famous argument that Van Inwagen ran where he worries about how you can get from necessity to contingency, right? So he's worrying about the kind of well-known arguments from contingency to the existence of a necessary being and thinking there's something a bit incoherent here. But I don't think that's right. I don't think that there's a problem if you think that that there's an initial thing, but it's kind of necessary that its evolution is chancy, indeterministic. Then I think that's a perfectly coherent picture. that avoids the difficulty that he was worrying about.
Yeah. So this necessary thing, substance, whatever you want to call it, what do you think the nature of it is? Does it have telos built into it? Is it powerful? Or is it just
None
devoid
of that.
of
None of those things. None of
none
those
of them?
things.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, physics doesn't tell us what the universe was like
Right.
after
Yeah.
the before the inflationary era. We just can't look back there. But what I'm talking about is just the first is the universe, the first state of the physical universe. What I don't know is what's in it, right?
Hmm.
So because nobody does, and there are people who have hopes that we can describe it using some string theory or some kind of quantum gravitational theory of some other kind or whatever, but we don't know, right? So I'm not. You can't do physics a priori. I can't possibly tell you what's in the initial state,
Hmm.
right? What the universe was like at assuming that there's a first time. Now,
Yeah.
I have an open mind too about whether there is um, an initial state like that, or whether there's a larger multiverse and there's some cause for our universe, right? I mean, there are physicists who say that kind of thing too. So I have an open mind about that.
Hmm. Okay. So the next question is thoughts on new atheism, but let me save that since the others kind of tie in with what we're talking about now. So why does anything exist at all on your view instead of nothing?
Yeah. So on the view that there's a necessary initial state, stuff exists because it has to, right?
Mhm.
I mean, what's necessary requires no further explanation um, beyond just pointing to its necessity. So that will be my why is there something rather than nothing? The answer is there had to be. There
Yep.
aren't many answers that you can give to this question. One is there's no answer to that question, and one is because there has to be.
Yeah.
A third possibility might be um, there always has been. So infinite regress, right? For any particular bit of it, we can explain it in terms of something else.
Yes.
If you then ask the question, why is there an infinite regress? I've You've got the first two options.
That's what I
There's
was going to ask you next.
no reason, or
Yeah.
because there has to be, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um, last option, maybe you might try saying because it's good that there's something. That's John Leslie's um, axiarchical answer. I just don't think that that's in the ballpark of being a satisfactory answer, right?
Hmm.
I just don't think that value, goodness or whatever, has that kind of productive power.
Hmm. Well, that was my next question. So, is an infinite regress possible? And I would assume maybe you would say yes, but maybe no, because you think there's a necessary foundation.
So I think it depends. So my favorite account of modality is one which says that all worlds share some history with the actual world and branch off it when indeterminism plays out differently, right? So that's all the possibilities that there are. So now, is there an could there be an infinite regress? Depends upon whether there actually is one or not. So
Hmm.
if there is actually is, if the kind of people who say there's a multiverse and it regresses infinitely, if they're right, then the answer is going to be yes, it's possible because actual. On the other hand, if there's an absolute beginning just before the inflationary period, then I'm going to say no, it's not possible. Right.
Hmm.
So it's because I have this actualist view about modality that lots of questions are going to get what might seem like unexpected answers. It just depends, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
possible or not depends upon how things actually are, and we don't know how things actually are.
Hmm. Yeah, because I mean, that question is always still left because some people say, "Oh, he just could go on forever," but there's got to be some kind of the buck has to stop somewhere, I would think, and uh, even if you adhere to the PSR, there has to be some kind of explanation for it, whether that explanation is external or internal. Right? Would you agree with
So,
that?
so I think that it's an interesting question whether, if you think that there are first things, right,
Mm-hmm.
causally first things, whether it's better to say they're, the first things are brutally contingent or that they're brutally necessary, because those are your two options. Once, if you say things are necessary, there's no explaining why they're necessary, right? That's where
Yeah.
explanation comes to an end. And if you
Yeah.
say that they're brutally contingent, then you've just said that's where explanation ends. Now, um, it's a bit hard to know what's better. I lean towards favoring necessities, as you might have
Yeah.
gathered. So,
Right. Right.
if I have to make a call, then I'm going to favor the idea that that somehow or other there's necessity built into the foundation, if you want to put it that way. But I don't have any particularly strong arguments that I can give in favor of making that choice rather than going the contingent way. And if you survey opinion amongst naturalists, you might find that the majority opinion goes in the other direction, that the majority opinion favors going for brute contingency rather than
Mm.
for brute necessity.
Yeah.
One person who I think went my way um, was Hume. So, in the dialogues concerning natural religion, um, Hume says ultimately we're going to have to appeal to some kind of necessary principle of order. We might as well just build it into the universe in the initial state, right? There's no
Mm.
advantage in supposing that we need a God that we're going to attribute that principle to.
Mm.
So, now you can contest that way of reading Hume, but that's, I think, of Hume as kind of leaning
Yeah.
in that direction.
Yeah. Um, that idea of brute contingency just strikes me as incorrect because a contingent phenomenon is a contingent phenomenon, right? You're still left with why is there any contingency at all? So it seems like that idea that necessity is
Yeah.
built into the fabric of reality to even produce any contingency, any contingent state of affairs, you know? So I
So,
adhere to necessity as well.
right.
Yeah.
So, part of what's going on here is um, the question about whether explanation can terminate with something that just has no explanation.
Yeah.
That's just, but that could have been otherwise,
Mhm.
right? So, lots of people, especially people who are kind of partial to some kind of principle of sufficient reason, they're going to say, no, that's not acceptable. But then what's the point of disagreement here will be about the principle of sufficient reason, the
Yeah.
thing that's driving you to make that judgment.
Hmm.
So I'm sort of partial to the idea that we can have, as naturalists, we can have a fairly strong principle of sufficient reason, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of naturalists out there who just think we should give up on the principle of sufficient reason, the kind of metaphysics that goes along with that,
Yeah.
and just suppose that at a certain point, explanation just runs out.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah, because I've heard Phaser say before, Ed Phaser, that it's kind of like saying I'm a little bit pregnant. You either are or you're not. There's either explanations all the way down or there are none at all. So if there's only a little bit of explanation
Yeah.
over here, but none over here,
So,
that
so
seems
that's cool.
problematic.
That's clearly false, right? So just forget about the big picture and think about why I've got a cup of tea with me now. There's an explanation for that, right? I went to the tea room. I filled up the cup with water from the urn. Right? Of course, there are explanations. What you might think is that, okay, that explanation tells you a little bit of a local story. There's got to be a bigger story that it embeds in. But of course, I can give you some of that too, if you really want to know, right, what I've been doing for the last few hours,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, the idea that the explanations that we give one another depend upon being able to embed them in a total story of everything that either terminates in necessity, in which case all our explanations are okay, or if it terminates in brute contingency, none of our explanations are okay. That's absurd, right? Explanations are stuff we do. We give one another explanations and they're perfectly acceptable, even if we're not thinking at all about that bigger picture,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I don't accept what Faze is saying there,
Mm-hmm.
even though I think we end up on the same side when it comes to the question about
Right.
what lies at the origin.
Yes. Yes. Like I said earlier, that it's either an internal explanation or external. So, did
Sorry, what's the?
oh no, I just said you talked about the origin. Like
Yeah.
my view is that there are explanations all the way down. I do concur with Phaser that it's just either external or internal, where that bruteness would just be eh, internal, an internal explanation, namely God. If if you take that route.
So I think if you think that it's explanation to God, you're going to think that God's necessary, but then I don't see how you can have any further explanation of
Mm-hmm.
that necessity, because I think that explanations, once you appeal to necessity, you've reached that end point, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
what's necessary is so no matter what. So don't try
Mm-hmm.
and give me a what, right?
Right.
There's
Yeah.
right once we've got there. So I'm not sure that the kind of internal external is really going to help, right? The point is just that if we hit things in our theorizing that we deem to be necessary, we're just saying those things is where our giving of explanations terminates. This is where it's going to terminate. Right now, if you go for brute as opposed to necessary for the first things, you're also saying this is where it terminates,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what you're leaving out is the possibility of having an explanation for why those things are as they are, because you can say they had to be, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
have an explanation for that. And if you just accept that necessities don't have explanations, then you think, well, that's a kind of acceptable stopping point, where in a way that stopping with something contingent doesn't feel acceptable in the
Yeah.
same way. Because if it's contingent, it could have been otherwise, but there's no mechanism that produced this rather than the other things that could have happened. There's nothing to say about why we got this rather than those other things. And that seems slightly odd, or at any rate, it does to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. So we'll kind of switch gears a little bit. What are your thoughts on new atheism?
Hmm. So it's kind of a vague term, and it's also not clear to me that it's a really well chosen term. And it is
Mm-hmm.
true that people like Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris were atheists, but they were also, and kind of more interestingly, irreligionists. And it would have been better to call them the new irreligionists than to call them the new atheists, because
Yeah.
the kind of message that they were primarily running really wasn't about atheism, it was about irreligion. And when you think about them from the standpoint of irreligion, it's interesting that there really isn't that much that's new in what they're doing. So I recommend to people who kind of got upset by what Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris were writing to go and read Tom Paine.
Mm-hmm.
Read the first part, the first volume of The Age of Reason, which appeared in 1794. And what's interesting about Payne is he's a deist. So in the book, you get all these arguments for the existence of God alongside all this stuff that could have been written by Hitchens and Dawkins and Harris about how terrible religion is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. So I think there's a bit of, I mean, that kind of hysterical reaction to the so-called new atheists was predicated on a fair bit of historical ignorance, in my view.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think there's certainly an inferior group as compared to the likes of uh, J.L. Mackie, Sobel, Nietzsche, you, so they're really not interested in philosophical arguments at all, even for atheism.
So, but by and large, I mean, Dawkins has a kind of interesting argument or two in
Mhm.
the God delusion. I mean, there's some stuff about traditional arguments there. My big complaint against the new irreligionists is what they have to say about religious moderates and religious liberals, because they kind of think that we should just group the religious people all together as fanatics, right?
Yeah,
And
definitely.
and that just seems wrong to me. I actually think that for lots of people who are religious liberals or religious moderates, we're much more likely to make common cause on things that really matter. I mean, whether we're religious or not, if whether, for example, you're a religious liberal or a kind of um, naturalistic liberal, really doesn't matter that much. What matters a lot more is what we're going to do about things like global warming and racism and the undermining of press freedom and 1,000 other
Mhm.
issues that are really acute that we have to be worrying about right now. Anyway, that's my view.
Yeah, no, that's great. I would largely agree with a lot of that. Um, okay, so question 8 was a question for my friend August. So it's just a little passage from Hart's book, and I'm just going to read it real quick. So, in the experience of God, David Bentley Hart, by the way, writes 3 or 4 decades ago, a comfortable and complacent atheism was the nearly universal consensus of philosophical faculties throughout the developed world. But over the past generation or so, there has been a resurgence of extremely sophisticated forms of theistic philosophy in the academic realm, including a remarkable revival of many traditional theistic arguments. Many of the better and more reflective atheist philosophers openly acknowledge that their position is largely an ideological commitment, not simply the inevitable conclusion of conscientious reasoning, and that the other side has formidable arguments of its own. So, August wanted to ask you, how would you respond to this? Do you agree with Hart's comments? I can read it again if need be.
Yeah, I've printed it out just in case,
Oh,
so
cool.
I've got it.
Yeah, it's some.
I've got it.
Yeah.
I've got it to refer to.
Oh, great.
So
Yeah.
so I think that there's something that Hart's importantly wrong about at the beginning, but I'm happy with some of the things that he says at the end about what the ways in which reflective atheists and reflective theists in philosophical circles think about one another's views. Right. So I'm kind of happy with that. It's not that I guess I think there are good arguments on either side, but there's nothing irrational in winding up on one side or the other. Right.
Mhm.
The bit that I object to is what he says about what philosophy departments were like in, say, the 1950s and 1960s. Right. That comfortable and complacent atheism was nearly universal throughout the developed world. I think that's false. I think that there were just as many Christian theists in philosophy departments in the 50s and 60s as there are now. Now, I don't have as much data as I would like to have about this, so I'm going to start with an anecdote. So, in the mid 1950s, the University of Tasmania had a short list for a job in philosophy, that amongst the candidates were J.L. Mackie and a man named Sidney Sparks Orr. Now, Mackie, we all know, was a brilliant philosopher. Orr, on the other hand, was given the position because he was, and I quote, a good Christian man. And if you want to know how that turned out for the University of Tasmania, you should read Cassandra Pybus's book, Gross Moral Turpitude. Right, the appointment was a disaster. Had they appointed Mackie, it would not have been. Right. Now, I think that the University of Tasmania and the view that they used in making their appointment to their philosophy department would have been way more representative of the developed world than not in the 1950s. So I think Hart's just wrong. That was not an instance of comfortable and complacent atheism, right? On the contrary. So that would be the point that I would make. That I think now you might say, well, that was one data point. So let me give you another one. Right. Again, so as you can probably guess, I've done a bit of digging around. I would like to know more about what was actually the state of philosophy departments in the 50s, bearing in mind that the developed world's a big place with lots of backwaters, right? And you're making a generalization about all of it. But let's pick somewhere that wasn't a backwater. Let's pick Princeton in the early 50s. So who was there? Well, there was Jacques Maritain, a very famous Catholic priest. There was Walter Kaufmann, a very, very well-known Jewish philosopher. Yes, by this point of his career, he was an atheist, but he was passionately interested in philosophy of religion. There was Walter Stace, who wrote a huge amount of stuff about mysticism. There was James Ward Smith, and there was Nicholas Rescher, a very well-known Christian philosopher. The idea that that department is a haven for, what was it, comfortable and complacent atheism is just, well, it's beyond words, right? Now, that was Princeton. Similar thing at Yale. So I did some digging around, right? I can't see either for backwaters like the University of Tasmania or for world-leading places like Princeton and Yale that what Hart said is true, right? And of course, I don't have what's required is somebody to do the systematic work of going around, getting the records from all of the departments and finding out what people believed, right? Nobody's done that work, but the little bit of work that I've done doesn't trend in the direction that Hart says that it does, right? So that was kind of the thing that I wanted to respond to in that quote.
Oh, great. Well, I appreciate you doing the research, Graham, and August will see this. So that's great. Okay, so this is the last question. What would it take for you to be convinced of not only theism, but Christianity? So, Graham, you don't strike me at all as a, what J.L. Mackie would, or I'm sorry, J.L. Schellenberg would say, resistant non-believer. You strike me as someone who's open to the existence of God, is exploring the arguments, has been. So what would it take you to believe in God?
So given what I said before, you should suspect that the answer is going to be I would have to change my mind about the cumulative case, right? And there are two ways that could go. I could either come to think that I was mistaken in my judgments about the relative simplicity of the competing positions, or that I'd made some sort of mistake in weighing the evidence, right? Now, that could happen, right? And that's what it would take for me to make the change between, being an atheist and being a theist. And were I to become a theist, then there'd be this further question, which would again be a question about weighing all of the evidence about, whether to be a Muslim or a Jew or Christian or some kind of Hindu or whatever. Right. I do think the question's kind of odd because I suspect that that's not the kind of answer that people who ask this question are looking for, even though it seems to me that it's the right answer to give, right? But there's kind of similar questions that you can ask back. So suppose that you're a Democrat and I ask you, what would it take for you to become a Trumpian, right? You might just start scratching your head and think, what do you want me to say other than just to repeat in this new context what I said before,
Yeah.
right? Why think that it's any different when it comes to this question about religious belief, right? There's lots of other things, kind of identity constituting beliefs, if you like, about which we're just similarly, all we can say is a kind of some sort of vague general thing, it
Yeah.
seems to me. Now, you might have thought, because some people do say this, um, from Hume to Keith Parsons, you find people saying, suppose that there was this voice from the sky, speaking to everybody in a language that each person could understand, saying, I'm the Lord your God. Right. But that's just not going to happen. Right. And it's not worth worrying about how would we respond to that if it did happen is quite unclear. Maybe we
Hmm.
start checking all the water supplies to see whether there's a whole lot of acid that had dropped into the water supplies. I don't know what we'd do, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that kind of speculation strikes me as completely pointless.
Yeah. I guess the next question, just before we go, would be, do you want God to exist? Now, I think of Blaise Pascal, how he said a lot of us arrive at our beliefs with what we want to exist or what we find beautiful. So some of the greatest minds all throughout history have affirmed God's existence. And but take someone like Thomas Nagel, where he has openly said, I don't want God to exist. I want the universe to not be like that. So do you think you're the kind of person that would want God to exist, or maybe indifferent, or you do not want God to exist at all?
So they're kind of funny. So I've written something about this recently, on the axiology of theism for a book that Kurt Lougheed is editing with some other people. And I the position that I develop, which I think is different from the other positions that are out there. So it's different from Nagel's position and it's different from the kind of Pascalian position, is that if, like me, you think that it's impossible that there are gods, then you just don't have any desires, right?
Mm,
I mean, once you've got a belief that something's impossible, and you really believe that it's impossible, then you stop having any desires in connection with it. So I don't have any desires one way or the other. That's my position. I think that's quite accurate. It's not that I don't want there to be a God. It's not that I want there to be a God. Um, so yeah, I'll leave you with that.
yeah. So I just wanted to backtrack just real quick. Did you say it was impossible to what to for you to believe in God or to know that God exists?
Yeah. So no, I just think that it's impossible that there are gods. That's just
Okay.
part of my worldview.
Right.
And while I'm not absolutely committed to that, right, that is the way I live, right? This is the way I think about things.
Mhm.
And so I just don't have any desires. It would be like having desires either for or against the Easter Bunny delivering you eggs
Mhm.
next
Yeah.
Easter. I just don't have any desires in connection with that because that's, it's not in the range of possibilities, right?
Hmm. Now, some
Um,
people could push back and say, "Well, Graham, you don't have full epistemological access to the origins of ultimate reality. At least maybe allow for a little bit of wiggle room there. Maybe God exists." What would you say to that?
so, so I mean, there is wiggle room, right? The wiggle room lies in going back and redoing the judgments, which
Hmm.
I'm open to do, right? But my what governs my life is the worldview that I've got at the moment, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me to make sense that my desires are keyed to how I think the world is now, right? I mean, that's enough to worry about, not worrying about all the different ways that in the future my worldview could be um, potentially revised. So I actually, as things now stand, given the way I think things are, I just don't have any desires on this matter.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because Anthony Flew, you're familiar with him, obviously. He was an atheist his entire academic career, but then he came around to becoming a believer in God. And a lot of people said, well, you're getting kind of old. I think you're just scared of dying. But I think he really assessed the arguments and looked at them and came to that conclusion. But ultimately, it's difficult to say sometimes why some believe and others don't. That would require us to psychologize people and various different kinds of things.
So the Flew case is controversial because he was quite advanced in years, and there were questions about the extent to which what was said really reflected his views. So I knew some people who knew Flew really well. For example, Jack Smart and Flew were quite close, corresponded a lot, and Jack had the office opposite mine here at Monash for the last 10 years or so of his life. 10, maybe it was longer, maybe it was 15 years. So I talked to him about lots of things, and he was quite skeptical. That Flew really had changed his mind in the way that it was portrayed by certain people.
Yeah, because he even wrote that book.
And given that Jack knew Flew really well, I kind of give some weight to that.
Right. Okay, well, Graham, thank you so much for coming on. This was an amazing discussion. It was such an honor to chat with you, and I hope we can do it again sometime, maybe talk about a different topic.
So thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed the conversation too. I like having conversations like this one.
It's great. Yeah, they could go on for much longer. They're eternal conversations, as I like to call them. Yeah. So, all right, Graham, have a good one.
Okay.
All right, take care, man. Bye.